They laughed at her cave until it became their salvation. The child was dying. 4 years old, lips the color of winter sky, skin so pale it seemed to glow in the firelight like something no longer quite of this world. Her small chest barely rose and fell, each breath a whisper, each heartbeat a prayer that might go unanswered. Cordelia Ashford pressed another heated stone against the girl's tiny body, wrapped it carefully in cloth worn soft from years of use, tucked it beneath the blankets she had piled high. The heat from the stone would fade in 20 minutes. She had been replacing them every 20 minutes for 6 hours now. Her arms ached from lifting. Her eyes burned from smoke and exhaustion. But she did not stop. She would not stop. The mother knelt beside her, weeping without sound, her shoulders shaking with each silent sob, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had gone white as bone. Her name was Margaret Morrison. She had 3 children and a husband who had died of typhoid the previous spring, leaving her alone in a land that did not welcome women without men to speak for them. 2 months ago, this same woman had stood in the middle of Sweetwater's only street and called Cordelia a cave witch. She had gathered her skirts away from the dust, pulled her children close against her legs, and hurried past with her nose tilted toward the sky, as if madness were something you could catch like fever. Now Margaret Morrison knelt on the stone floor of that very cave, begging Cordelia to save her daughter's life. 23 people huddled in the darkness behind them. 23 souls who had mocked, ridiculed, and shunned the widow who chose to live underground like some kind of animal. They had called her names. They had laughed at her. They had warned their children to stay away from the crazy woman in the canyon. Outside, the blizzard screamed across the Arizona territory with a fury that had already claimed houses, barns, livestock, and lives. The wind howled through the canyon like the voice of something ancient and hungry, something that had existed before humans walked the earth and would exist long after they were gone. Snow piled against the entrance wall in drifts that grew deeper with every passing hour. But inside this cave, carved deep into the red rock of the canyon wall by millennia of water and wind, the air remained warm and still. A small fire crackled cheerfully in the hearth Cordelia had built from flat stones. Soup simmered in a cast-iron pot, filling the space with the smell of onions and herbs. And Cordelia Ashford worked through her 3rd sleepless night, fighting to keep a child alive. The mother looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes that held nothing but desperation and a fragile, flickering hope. "Please, I know what I said about you. I know what we all said. God forgive me. I know every cruel word, but please, she is all I have left in this world." Cordelia did not respond with words. What could she say? That she understood loss? That she knew what it meant to watch someone you love slip away, helpless to stop it? That she had buried her own husband in unmarked desert, alone with nothing but a bond and a broken heart? She simply reached for another stone from the fire, tested its warmth against her palm, and wrapped it carefully in flannel. Some lessons, she had learned, could only be taught by winter. The story of how Cordelia Ashford came to live in a cave in Red Rock Canyon began, as so many stories of the American West began, with death and dreams intertwined in ways that could not be separated. Her husband Everett had been a carpenter from Cornwall, England, a man who could look at a piece of raw timber and see the chair, the table, the cradle, the home hiding inside it, waiting to be born under his skilled hands. He had fingers that could coax beauty from rough wood and a laugh that made strangers feel like old friends within minutes of meeting him. When he smiled, his whole face participated in the expression, his eyes crinkling at the corners, his joy so genuine that it seemed to warm the air around him. They had met at a church social in Penzance when Cordelia was 22 years old, still young enough to believe that love could conquer anything, still innocent enough to think that happiness, once found, would last forever. She had been standing alone by the refreshment table, uncomfortable in her Sunday dress, watching the other young women flirt and laugh with the young men, feeling herself to be somehow separate from their easy joy. And then Everett had appeared beside her, a cup of punch in each hand, his smile warm and his eyes kind. "You look like someone who needs rescuing from the salmon sandwiches." She had laughed despite herself, and that had been the beginning of everything. She was the daughter of a tin miner, a man named Arthur Ashford, who had spent 40 years descending into the darkness beneath Cornwall's green hills and emerging again with ore and stories in a cough that grew worse each winter. Her father had taught her things no proper English lady was supposed to know. How to read the rock, the subtle striations and colors that told you whether stone was stable or ready to fall. How to feel the temperature of the earth change as you descended. How to build shelter in places where shelter seemed impossible. The ground keeps its own temperature, girl, her father had told her when she was just a child, lowering her carefully into one of the abandoned mines by lantern light. 54 degrees, summer or winter, rain or shine. The earth remembers what we forget. The earth protects what we cannot protect ourselves. You remember that, Cordelia. Remember it when the world above fails you. She had remembered. God help her, she had remembered everything. She married Everett against her mother's mild protests and spent 12 happy years building a life with him in their small cottage by the sea. 12 years of waking to his face in the morning light, of falling asleep to the sound of his breathing in the darkness, of building something together that felt permanent and real. Their cottage stood on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic, where the sound of waves crashing against rocks served as a constant lullaby. Everett had built most of the furniture himself, each piece a labor of love. The kitchen table where they shared their meals, the rocking chair where Cordelia sat in the evenings, mending clothes while Everett read aloud from books borrowed from the lending library. The bed frame he had carved with intricate patterns of roses and vines. A wedding gift that had taken him 3 months to complete. They never had children, though not for lack of wanting, not for lack of praying, not for lack of holding each other through the disappointment of month after empty month. The doctors had no explanation. Some women simply could not bear children, they said, as if that explained anything, as if that made the emptiness any easier to bear. But they had each other, and for Cordelia, that had been enough. More than enough. In a world where so many marriages were arrangements of convenience or necessity, theirs had been built on genuine love, on laughter shared over simple meals, on comfort offered during difficult times, on the quiet certainty that whatever happened, they would face it together. When the tin mines began to close and work grew scarce, when the future in Cornwall seemed to shrink smaller every year, Everett heard stories of opportunity in America, land for the taking in the Western Territories, a chance to start over. What do you say, Cordy? Shall we have an adventure? They sold everything they owned. The cottage by the sea, the furniture Everett had made with his own hands, the garden where Cordelia had grown roses and herbs, where she had spent countless hours with her hands in the soil. They booked a passage on a steamship and arrived in New York Harbor in the spring of 1882, standing at the rail together, watching the Statue of Liberty rise from the morning mist like a promise. The harbor was crowded with ships from every nation, their flags snapping in the wind. The air smelled of salt and coal smoke and possibility. Around them, other immigrants wept and prayed and pointed at the great green lady with her torch held high. Everett had squeezed her hands so tightly she thought her fingers might break. A new beginning, a new life, everything we ever wanted, Cordy. It is all out there waiting for us. New York itself was overwhelming. The noise, the crowds, the sheer scale of everything. Buildings taller than any Cordelia had ever seen. Streets packed with people speaking a dozen different languages. The constant clatter of horse-drawn carriages and the shouts of vendors selling everything from newspapers to roasted chestnuts. They did not stay long. The city was not for them. They were country people, used to open spaces and quiet nights. So they gathered their belongings and continued west. From New York, they traveled by train to Kansas City, then by wagon toward the Arizona Territory, where they had heard the climate was mild and the land was waiting for those brave enough to claim it. They traveled for weeks through plains that seemed to stretch forever beneath skies so vast they made Cordelia dizzy, through mountains that touched the clouds, through deserts that shimmered with heat and silence. Everett drove the wagon during the day, his strong hands steady on the reins. At night, they camped beneath stars so bright, Cordelia felt she could reach up and touch them. We are going to build something beautiful, Cordy. A home, a ranch, a life. Something that will last long after we are gone. Everett never saw Arizona. 3 weeks into their wagon journey, somewhere in the vast emptiness of the New Mexico territory, he developed a fever. It started small, just a headache that would not fade. But the fever grew. It spread through his body like fire through dry grass. His skin burned to the touch. His eyes grew glassy and distant. Cordelia tried everything she knew. Cool cloths on his forehead, changed every hour. Willow bark tea, prayers whispered into the darkness while coyotes howled in the distance. She held his hand through the long nights, felt his pulse flutter and fade beneath her fingers, watched the man she loved slip away from her inch by inch. None of it mattered. He died on a Tuesday morning, just as the sun was painting the desert in shades of gold and pink. The sky had never been more beautiful. The world had never seemed more cruel. His last words were her name, spoken so softly she had to lean close to hear. Cordelia, my love, build something beautiful. She buried him beside the trail, marking the grave with stones she gathered from the surrounding desert, her hands raw and bleeding by the time she was done. She had no lumber for a proper marker, so she used her knife to scratch his name into a flat piece of sandstone. Everett Ashford, beloved husband, 1847 to 1882. She sat beside that grave until sunset, her hand resting on the freshly turned earth, her heart emptied of everything except a hollow ache that she knew would never fully heal. Then she climbed back onto the wagon seat, took the reins in her blistered hands, and drove on toward Arizona. What else could she do? There was no going back. The money was spent. The life in Cornwall was gone. All that remained was forward, into a future she would now face alone. Her only companion was Copper, a hound dog the color of a new penny, whom Everett had found abandoned as a puppy 3 years before. The dog had been his constant shadow, and now he transferred that loyalty to Cordelia, sleeping pressed against her back each night, his warmth a small comfort against the vastness of her grief. She arrived in Sweetwater, Arizona territory, in late September of 1882, with $16 to her name, a wagon full of tools and memories, and a heart that had learned to function despite being broken. Sweetwater was not much of a town, a general store with a crooked porch, a saloon that smelled of whiskey and regret, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, its white paint peeling in the desert sun. Perhaps 50 wooden structures scattered along a single dusty street, all of them looking temporary, as if a strong wind might carry them away. Cordelia guided her wagon to the general store and climbed down on legs stiff from weeks of travel. Copper jumped down beside her, his nose immediately working the unfamiliar scents. The store was run by a man named Silas Brennan, 55 years old, with a belly that spoke of prosperity and eyes that calculated the worth of everything they saw. He watched Cordelia enter with the particular expression men reserve for women who appeared without male escort. Help you? I need supplies, flour, salt, beans, and I need to know if there is a boarding house where I might rent a room. Brennan's eyes traveled from her widow's black dress to the dusty wagon visible through his window. Traveling alone? I am now. My husband passed 3 weeks back. Something flickered in his expression. Not sympathy, more like reassessment. Sorry for your loss. Boarding house is full up, and we do not generally let rooms to women without proper supervision. Cordelia felt the first stirring of the anger that would become her constant companion in this place. I am not asking for charity. I can pay. It is not about money. Sweetwater is a respectable town. A woman alone, well, it raises questions, creates talk. You understand. She understood perfectly. She was a problem these people did not want to solve. The door opened behind her and Cordelia turned to see a man enter. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the bearing of someone who expected the world to arrange itself according to his preferences. His clothes were well-made, his boots were new. Everything about him announced wealth and arrogance. Brennan, I need those supplies loaded for the ranch. Right away, Mr. Crenshaw. So this was Harlan Crenshaw, the richest man in the territory, owner of the largest ranch, a man whose word was law. Crenshaw's gaze settled on her, moving up and down with the casual assessment of a man evaluating livestock. New arrival? A widow, Brennan said, looking for a homestead. Crenshaw smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. A widow, alone in the territory. That is no kind of life for a woman. Perhaps you should consider returning to wherever you came from. I have nowhere to return to, and I am quite capable of... Capability is not the issue. Crenshaw cut her off. The issue is propriety. A woman alone invites speculation, trouble. We have built something civilized here in Sweetwater. We prefer to keep it that way. He turned back to Brennan, dismissing her completely. Cordelia stood in that general store surrounded by the overwhelming weight of male certainty and felt something shift inside her. Something hard, something determined. She had traveled 3,000 miles. She had buried her husband in unmarked desert. She had driven a wagon alone through wilderness that would have broken many men. And now these people were telling her she did not belong. Very well then, she would make her own place to belong. It was Thomas Chen who showed her kindness first. He ran a small trading post at the edge of town. He was 58 years old, born in Canton, weathered by decades of facing the particular hostility America reserved for those who looked different. When Cordelia entered his shop, he did not look at her with suspicion or pity. He simply nodded and asked what she needed. Information. I need to know about the land around here, the canyons, the caves. His eyebrows rose slightly. Caves? I was raised in mining country, Cornwall, in England. My father worked the tin mines for 40 years. I know how to live underground. I know how to make shelter in stone. Thomas Chen studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled. There is a canyon, Red Rock Canyon, 8 miles north. Beautiful country, but the land is not good for farming or ranching. Too rocky, too steep. That is why no one has claimed it. But there are caves. Many caves. The Pueblo people used them long ago. People here think living in a cave is primitive. But the Pueblo knew something these newcomers have forgotten. The earth protects what it shelters. Cordelia felt hope stir in her chest for the first time since Everett's death. Why are you helping me? Because I know what it is to be unwelcome. What it is to have people decide who you are before you have spoken a word. And because my grandmother lived in a cave in China for 3 years during a war, she said it was the safest she ever felt. She found the cave 3 days later, and the moment she stepped inside, she knew she was home. She had been searching all morning, climbing over rocks, exploring crevices, dismissing shelter after shelter as too small, too exposed, too unstable. The sun was high overhead, beating down with the relentless intensity of the desert, and she was beginning to despair. Then she saw it, a dark opening in the rock face, perhaps 50 feet above the canyon floor, protected from the elements by an overhang of stone, wide enough and tall enough that she could walk in without ducking. The climb was not difficult. Centuries of water had carved natural steps into the rock, and she found handholds where she needed them. Copper waited below, barking encouragement, unwilling to attempt the ascent himself. The cave mouth was 20 feet wide, 15 feet high. Cordelia stepped inside, and the temperature changed immediately. Outside, the air was hot, perhaps 90 degrees in the shade. But here, just a few steps into the rock, the air was cool and still. She felt it on her skin like a blessing, like a promise. She lit the lantern she had brought and walked deeper. The main chamber was wound with a ceiling that arched overhead like the dome of a cathedral. The floor was smooth, worn down by ages of water that had long since found another path. The walls glittered faintly where minerals caught the lantern light, winking like distant stars in an underground sky. Beyond the main chamber, she found 2 smaller rooms branching off, each about the size of a generous bedroom. Natural fissures in the rock provided ventilation, drawing air through the cave in a gentle, constant flow. The air was fresh, not stale. This place breathed. In the deepest chamber, she found a spring of fresh water, seeping through the rock and collecting in a natural basin carved by centuries of dripping. She knelt beside it, cupped her hands, and drank. The water was cold and clean and sweet, better than any water she had tasted in months. And the temperature, cool, steady, exactly as her father had promised all those years ago in the mines of Cornwall. The earth remembers, he had said. The earth protects. Cordelia sat down on the smooth stone floor and began to cry. Not from sadness, not anymore. These were different tears. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of a hope she had thought was dead rising unexpectedly back to life. She had found her home. What would you do in Cordelia's place? She has found shelter, but she is alone in an unforgiving wilderness. The people of Sweetwater have already made clear she is not welcome. Winter is coming. Would you take the risk? Would you try to make a life in this cave, knowing the mockery and hardship that awaits? Think about it. Then continue reading to see what Cordelia decided. The work began the next morning, before the sun had fully risen over the canyon walls. Cordelia woke in the back of her wagon, copper curled warm against her legs, and for a moment she did not know where she was. Then memory returned, and with it, purpose. She had found her cave. Now she had to make it into Moanishawan. She started with the entrance. The cave mouth was wide and open, exposed to whatever weather the canyon might bring. If she was going to live here through winter, she needed a wall, a proper wall, with a door she could bar against wind and cold and whatever else might come in the night. Her father had taught her how to work with stone. In Cornwall, the miners built walls from the rock they excavated, fitting pieces together like puzzle pieces, using gravity and geometry instead of mortar when mortar was scarce. It was ancient work, the kind of building humans had done for thousands of years before lumber and nails made everyone forget the old ways. Stone does not rot, her father had told her. Stone does not burn. Stone does not blow away in the wind. Stone remembers. Stone endures. If you build with stone, girl, you build for the ages. She gathered rocks from the canyon floor, selecting each one for size and shape. Flat pieces for the base, to create a stable foundation. Wedge-shaped pieces for the corners, where strength mattered most. Smaller fragments to fill the gaps between the larger stones. Each rock was different, and each had to be examined, turned, tested before she could determine its place in the wall. She mixed mortar from red clay and sand, following a technique she had learned from a Mexican woman named Elena during the wagon journey west. Elena had been traveling with her husband and 3 children, heading to California to join relatives. She had shown Cordelia how to find the right clay, how to mix it with sand in the proper proportions, how to apply it so it would set hard and strong. "The earth gives us what we need," Elena had said in her musical English. "We only have to know how to ask." The work was slow, back-breaking. By the end of the first day, Cordelia had managed perhaps 2 feet of wall. Her hands were raw, blistered, bleeding in places where the rough stone had torn the skin. Her back screamed with every movement. Her shoulders ached from lifting rocks that weighed more than she did. She fell asleep that night in the back of her wagon, too exhausted to eat, too exhausted even to undress, with copper pressed warm against her side. The second day was worse, and the third, and the fourth. But she did not stop. She would not stop. Day after day, she worked from dawn until darkness made it impossible to see, hauling stones up from the canyon floor, each trip a test of endurance, mixing mortar until her arms trembled, fitting piece to piece, layer to layer, building something from nothing with her own 2 hands. Her body adapted, her hands hardened, developing calluses where blisters had been. Her back grew stronger. Her eyes learned to read the stone, to see at a glance which rock would fit where, which piece would strengthen the wall, and which would weaken it. By the end of the 3rd week, the wall was finished, 6 feet of solid stone rising to meet the natural arch of the cave entrance. A heavy wooden door built from salvaged lumber and hung on leather hinges could be barred from inside with a beam of oak. 2 windows flanked the door, their shutters designed to open inward for light during the day, then close tight against the night. Inside, she continued to transform the raw stone into a home. She built a hearth from flat rocks, positioning it where natural fissures in the ceiling would draw the smoke away. She laid canvas over the stone floor, then covered it with rugs she had brought from England. She hung blankets to create doorways between the chambers. She built shelves into natural alcoves, and slowly, stone by stone, the cave became home. The skeptics began arriving almost immediately. Clement Farrow was first, a builder from Sweetwater, 45 years old, who had spent 20 years constructing homes throughout the territory. "This will not work," he announced after inspecting the wall. "No foundation, no proper frame. The first hard freeze will crack that mortar. This whole thing will collapse by spring." Cordelia continued fitting stones into a shelf. You will see. Then came Virgil Oakes, a 22-year-old who treated everything as a joke. He rode out with friends, passing a bottle between them. Hey, cave lady, when are you going to grow fur and start howling at the moon? His friends laughed. Cordelia did not respond. I give her 2 weeks. $5 says she is gone by Christmas. Then came Mrs. Eugenia Whitmore, the self-appointed social arbiter of Sweetwater. Poor creature, living in a hole like some kind of animal. It is simply not Christian. Then came Father O'Brien, the parish priest. My child, this is not how the Lord intended his children to live. Underground, like heathens. Surely there is a better path for you. Cordelia continued working. The Lord created this cave, Father. I do not think he objects to my using it. One morning in late October, Cordelia looked up from her work to see a small figure standing at the base of the cliff. A girl, perhaps 7 years old, with bright, curious eyes and hair the color of autumn leaves. It was Nell Brennan, the storekeeper's daughter. Cordelia climbed down to meet her. Does your father know you are here? Nell shook her head. He says I am not supposed to talk to you. He says you are crazy, but you do not look crazy to me. You look like someone who knows how to do things. Cordelia almost smiled. What do I look like I know how to do? Build things, make things. My father only knows how to sell things other people made. Can you teach me? It was a dangerous friendship. If Brennan found out, there would be consequences. But Cordelia looked at this child, this curious, brave child who had defied her father to seek out knowledge, and she could not turn her away. Come up, I will show you how to read stone. After that, Nell came every few days, always in secret, always with questions. Cordelia taught her how to select stones, how to test mortar, how to judge the angle of a joint. In return, Nell brought news from town, warnings about weather, and something Cordelia had almost forgotten existed. Friendship. But it was Harlan Crenshaw who came with cruelty in his heart. He arrived on a cold morning in late October, accompanied by 4 of his ranch hands. They rode up the canyon trail like men who owned the world. Well, the cave woman herself, I had to see it to believe it. Cordelia stood in her doorway, Copper growling softly at her feet. What do you want, Mr. Crenshaw? I want you to understand something. Sweetwater is my town. The people there do what I say. If I tell them not to sell to you, they will not sell. If I tell them not to hire you, they will not hire. Then I will manage without the town. He smiled, and the smile was worse than his anger. Winter is coming, Mrs. Ashford. The winters here kill. And when you are dying of cold and hunger, remember that you could have left when you had the chance. He turned his horse and rode away. Copper barked once, sharp and defiant, at their retreating backs. Cordelia returned to her work. But not everyone who came to Red Rock Canyon came to mock. Old Ida Hawkins was 75 years old and had been in Arizona since before there was a Sweetwater. She rode out on a mule one November afternoon, looked around at what Cordelia had built, and nodded slowly. Good work. Who taught you? My father. He was a miner in Cornwall. The old ways, the Pueblo built like this for 1,000 years. Still standing. She smiled. Round things last. Square things break. The earth protects what it shelters. And you, my dear, are going to survive. Young Phoebe Langston came too, a 16-year-old with curious eyes and questions her parents did not want her to ask. She watched Cordelia work and asked if she could learn. Phoebe spent hours at the cave, learning to read stone, to mix mortar, to build things that would last. And Thomas Chen came, bringing supplies and friendship. The only adult in the territory who treated Cordelia like a human being. We are keepers of old wisdom, he told her one evening, watching the sun set over the red rocks. You and I, we remember what others have forgotten. The cave home was finished by the 3rd week of November. The front wall stood solid and strong. A heavy wooden door could be barred from inside. 2 windows let in light during the day. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, soup simmered in a pot, and the air remained warm and still, while the November winds howled outside. She had done it. She had built a life with her own hands, in defiance of everyone who said it could not be done. But winter was coming, And winter, as Harlan Crenshaw had promised, was unforgiving. Cordelia has built her cave home against all odds. The people of Sweetwater have mocked her, threatened her, and predicted her failure. But winter is coming, and the worst blizzard in 50 years is about to strike. 23 people will soon need the shelter she has built. People who called her crazy, people who called her names. What do you think will happen? Comment your thoughts, then continue reading to discover the truth. Thomas Chen arrived at the cave on December 20th with worry in his eyes and supplies in his saddlebags. Storm coming. Bad one. The old-timers say they have not seen a sky like this in 30 years. Cordelia looked at the clouds gathering to the north. They were a strange color, gray with a tinge of green, moving with unnatural speed. How bad? Bad enough that I am bringing you extra food. He unloaded flour, salt pork, dried beans, coffee, and bad enough that I want you to know something. If it gets as bad as I think it will, I am coming here, and I may not be alone. You will be welcome. Anyone who needs shelter will be welcome. Thomas Chen smiled. You are a good woman, Mrs. Ashford. Better than they deserve. He rode away as the first snowflakes began to fall. The blizzard struck on December 23rd at 2 in the afternoon. It began with a deceptive gentleness, snow falling soft and steady. But within hours, the gentleness was gone. The wind came first, howling down from the north with a fury that seemed almost alive. It drove the snow sideways, a wall of white that reduced visibility to nothing. Then came the cold. 20 degrees, 10 degrees, 0, 20 below, 35 below. The temperature fell so fast it seemed to have forgotten the rules of nature. By nightfall, exposed skin could freeze in minutes. Breath turned to ice before it left your lips. Inside her cave, Cordelia sat beside her small fire and listened to the storm rage outside. The wind screamed across the canyon like a living thing. It found every crevice in the rock, every gap in the stone. She could hear it howling through the canyon, a sound like all the wolves in the world crying out at once. The wooden shutters she had built rattled in their frames, but they held. The door shook as gusts tried to force their way in, but the oak beam she had placed across it did not budge. She checked the thermometer she had hung on the wall. The temperature inside the cave had dropped slightly since the storm began, but not by much. The fire helped, but even without it, the thick stone walls held the warmth. This was what her father had taught her. This was what the Pueblo had known for 1,000 years. The earth keeps its own temperature. The earth protects. She thought about Sweetwater. She thought about all those wooden buildings with their thin walls and their gaps where the wind could enter. She thought about all those people who had laughed at her cave, who had called it primitive, who had warned their children to stay away from the crazy cave woman. Were they laughing now? She thought about Silas Brennan in his house behind the general store. Was his roof holding? Were his walls keeping out the cold? Was little Nell warm and safe, or was she shivering beneath every blanket in the house while her father burned furniture to keep the fire going? She thought about Harlan Crenshaw in his grand ranch house. He had the biggest house in the territory, everyone said. 3 stories, a dozen rooms, more fireplaces than one man could ever need. But all that wood, all those windows, all those places where the cold could creep in. Was his certainty keeping him warm tonight? She thought about Thomas Chen, and that worried her most of all. His trading post was a small building, not built for a storm like this. She hoped he had found shelter somewhere. She hoped he would remember what he had told her. If it gets bad, I am coming to your cave. Copper lay stretched before the fire, his golden eyes following Cordelia as she moved about the cave. He sensed her tension, her worry. Every time she sat down, he pressed his warm body against her legs, offering what comfort he could. She had plenty of food, plenty of wood, plenty of water from the spring in the back chamber. She could survive here for weeks if necessary. The question was, who else would survive? The first day of the storm was bad. Snow fell without stopping, piling higher and higher against the canyon walls. The wind never ceased, driving the snow into drifts that grew deeper by the hour. Cordelia kept the fire burning, kept water heating, kept checking her supplies. The second day was worse. The temperature dropped further, plunging into territory where survival became a moment-by-moment battle. In wooden houses with thin walls and rattling shutters, people would be burning everything they owned just to stay alive. They would be huddled together, watching their breath freeze in the air, wondering if they would see another sunrise. But in the cave, the thick stone walls held the warmth. The temperature remained steady. Cordelia was comfortable in a simple dress while death raged outside. By the third day, Christmas morning, the blizzard had become something out of nightmares. Cordelia opened her door at dawn, pushing against snow that had drifted 4 feet high against the wall. The world outside was white, utterly white. The canyon walls had vanished behind curtains of falling snow. The sky was invisible. Everything was white in wind and cold. And then, carried on that wind, she heard it. A voice, distant, desperate, almost lost in the howling. "Help! Someone help us!" Cordelia did not hesitate. She grabbed her heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf around her face until only her eyes were visible, and stepped out into the white. The cold hit her like a physical blow. It stole the breath from her lungs, froze the moisture in her nose, made her eyes water, and then froze the tears on her cheeks. The wind pushed against her with the force of a living thing, trying to knock her down, trying to drive her back into the shelter she had left. But she had heard a voice. Someone needed help. And Cordelia Ashford was not the kind of woman who ignored a cry for help, no matter who was crying. She followed the sound, fighting through drifts that came up to her waist, unable to see more than a few feet in any direction. The voice came again, closer now, guiding her through the white. She found them a quarter-mile south of the cave. A family. Father, mother, 3 children. They had been traveling from somewhere to somewhere else, caught on the open road when the storm hit. Their wagon was overturned, half buried in snow. Their horse was dead, frozen in its traces, and they huddled together in a depression in the rock, trying to shelter from the wind that wanted to kill them. The youngest child, a girl of perhaps 4, was unconscious in her mother's arms. Her lips were blue. Her skin was pale as snow. She was not shivering, which Cordelia knew was a very bad sign. When the body stopped shivering, it meant the body was giving up. The mother looked up at Cordelia with eyes that held no hope, only desperation. "Please, my baby. Please help my baby." Cordelia did not waste time with words. She took the child from the mother's arms, cradling the small body against her chest. The girl weighed almost nothing. "Follow me," she said to the family. "Stay close. Do not stop. No matter what happens, do not stop." And she began the brutal journey back to the cave. It was the longest quarter-mile of her life. The wind fought her every step, pushing against her with the force of a wall. The snow sucked at her boots, trying to drag her down. The cold bit through her coat, through her dress, through her skin, trying to reach the warmth at her core. The child in her arms was terrifyingly light, terrifyingly still. Cordelia could not tell if she was breathing. She could only hold her close and keep moving, one step after another, refusing to stop, refusing to give up. Behind her, she could hear the father gasping, struggling to carry his other children through the drifts. The mother stumbled and fell, picked herself up, stumbled again. They were all going to die out here, Cordelia thought. They were all going to become frozen statues, monuments to their own foolishness for venturing out into this white hell. But she kept moving, one step, then another, then another. The cave entrance appeared out of the white like a miracle. The dark mouth in the rock face, the wall she had built, the door she had hung with her own bleeding hands. Home, shelter, life. When Cordelia pushed open the door and warmth rushed out to meet them like a physical embrace, the mother collapsed to her knees in the snow. "Thank God," she gasped. "Thank God. Thank you. Oh God, thank you." Cordelia carried the unconscious child inside and laid her on a blanket near the fire. The family stumbled in behind her, snow falling from their clothes, their faces red and white with cold, and Cordelia began to work. She had learned emergency medicine from necessity, from books, from the Mexican woman she had met on the wagon trail. She knew that a body frozen was not yet a body dead. She knew that warmth, applied slowly and carefully, could bring people back from the very edge of the grave. She heated stones in the fire and wrapped them in cloth. She placed them against the child's core first, the chest and belly where the vital organs lived, then the neck where blood flowed to the brain, then the limbs, last of all, because warming them too quickly could send cold blood rushing back to the heart and stop it forever. She spooned warm broth between the blue's lips, a drop at a time. The child could not swallow, not yet, but the warmth would help. She rubbed the small hands and feet gently, trying to restore circulation without causing damage. Hours passed, the family huddled by the fire, watching, praying, weeping. The father held his other children close, his face a mask of terror and hope. The mother never looked away from her youngest, her eyes fixed on the small, still form. And Cordelia worked. She did not think about the fact that this woman had called her a cave witch. She did not think about the insults, the mockery, the way this family had crossed to the other side of the street to avoid passing near her. She did not think about justice or revenge or the satisfaction of being proven right. She thought only about the child, about the small body that had not chosen to be caught in a blizzard, had not chosen to be born to parents who mocked strangers. Children were innocent. That was what Cordelia had always believed. No matter what their parents had done, children deserved to live. The child did not wake. The mother's sobs grew more desperate. The father began to pray aloud, his voice cracking on familiar words. The other children cried, too young to understand what was happening, but old enough to feel the fear. And still, the child did not wake. Cordelia changed the stones again, checked the child's breathing, adjusted the blankets. Her own hands were shaking now from exhaustion, from cold, from the terrible weight of responsibility. She would not fail. She could not fail. And then, just as the sun was setting on Christmas Day, painting the snow outside in shades of gold and rose, the little girl opened her eyes. "Mama?" The sound that came from the mother's throat was not quite a scream and not quite a laugh. It was something rawer than either. Relief, joy, gratitude beyond words. She gathered her daughter in her arms and held her so tightly it seemed she would never let go. "Thank you," she sobbed into Cordelia's shoulder. "Thank you, thank you. I called you names, I said terrible things, and you saved her. You saved my baby." Cordelia did not know what to say, so she simply nodded and began preparing food for her unexpected guests. But the Morrison family was only the beginning. Over the next 12 hours, as the storm raged on into its fourth day, more survivors found their way to the cave in Red Rock Canyon. They came singly and in groups, drawn by desperation, by rumor, by the simple instinct to seek shelter when everything else had failed. Thomas Chen arrived with 3 other Chinese traders just before noon. All of them were frostbitten. All of them were terrified. Their trading post in Sweetwater had collapsed under the weight of snow, the roof caving in with a sound like thunder, nearly burying them alive. "I knew you would still be here," Thomas said, when he could speak again, his voice hoarse from cold. "I knew your cave would hold." It held. It will keep holding. Bring your friends to the fire. 2 women came next, stumbling through the drifts with arms linked together, supporting each other when neither could stand alone. Mary Douglas was a school teacher from Pennsylvania, traveling to a new posting in California. Rose Patterson was a widow from Kansas, heading to live with her sister in Tucson. They had been sharing a wagon when the storm hit, and their driver had abandoned them, taking the horses and disappearing into the white. "We thought we were going to die," Mary said, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form words. "We could not see anything. We could not feel our feet. We just kept walking, holding on to each other, waiting for the cold to take us." "But we did not let go," Rose added. "We made a promise. We said, if we are going to die, we are going to die together. But we are not going to give up." They had not given up. They had stumbled onto the canyon trail by pure chance, followed the rock wall by feel, and somehow found the cave. 3 cowboys arrived around midnight, half frozen, their horses dead, their cattle scattered across the territory. Their names were Jake and Samuel and William, young men who had been driving a herd to market when the storm hit. They had lost everything except their lives. "We saw the light," Jake explained, his hands wrapped around a mug of hot soup. Through the snow, just a little flicker. We thought we were imagining things at first, but we kept walking toward it. And here you were. Cordelia had hung a lantern outside the cave entrance, hoping someone might see it. Someone had. Young Phoebe Langston arrived just before dawn, her parents stumbling behind her. Their homestead roof had collapsed under the weight of snow, and they had walked 4 miles through the storm to reach the canyon. "I knew the way," Phoebe said, her eyes bright with exhaustion and triumph. "I have been coming here for weeks. I knew you would help us. I knew your cave would be safe." Her parents looked around at the warm, organized space, at the fire burning cheerfully, at the people huddled in every corner, and something shifted in their expressions. "We told her not to come here," Phoebe's father admitted quietly. "We said you were crazy. We said this cave was a death trap." "We were wrong, Robbie," Phoebe's mother said. "We were wrong about everything." And still, they kept coming. By dawn of the fourth day, 22 people had crowded into Cordelia's cave home. They filled every corner, lined every wall, huddled together even though warmth was not in short supply. The cave that the people of Sweetwater had called primitive, had called shameful, had called unfit for civilized habitation, now sheltered nearly 24 souls from a storm that wanted to kill them all. And then the 23rd arrived. This is the moment everything changes. Cordelia is about to face someone who tried to destroy her, someone who mocked her, threatened her, promised to make her life impossible. What would you do? Would you save the person who tried to ruin you? Pause here. Think about it. Then continue reading. Silas Brennan carried his daughter through the door just after sunrise. His face was white with frost, his eyes red from the wind, his expensive coat torn and useless. Little Nell, 7 years old, was limp in his arms, blood frozen in her hair from where falling debris had struck her when part of their roof collapsed. He had walked 3 miles through the storm to reach this place. 3 miles through snow that came up to his chest in places. 3 miles through wind that tried to knock him down with every step. 3 miles through cold that wanted to kill him and his daughter both. He had walked 3 miles to ask for help from the woman he had refused to house, refused to respect, refused to acknowledge as anything more than a problem to be solved. And when Cordelia opened the door and saw him standing there, saw little Nell unconscious in his arms, she did not hesitate. "Bring her in. Put her by the fire." Brennan's voice cracked as he spoke. "My house, the roof collapsed. My wife is at the church with the others. But Nell was hurt, and I heard there was shelter here. I heard you were taking people in." "I am." She took the child from his arms and went to work. The wound on Nell's head was not as bad as it had looked. The cold had slowed the bleeding. The skull was intact. Cordelia cleaned it carefully, applied a poultice of herbs and honey, wrapped it in clean bandages. Within an hour, Nell was awake, asking for water, asking for her mother, asking why everyone was crying. Brennan sat in a corner of the cave, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking. The man who had laughed at the widow's cave, who had refused her basic human dignity, who had warned others against associating with her, now owed her his daughter's life, and he knew it. He knew exactly what he owed. And still, the storm was not finished. The last arrival came that evening, carried unconscious by 2 of his own ranch hands. Harlan Crenshaw. His horse had thrown him somewhere between his ranch and the town, panicked by the wind and the endless white. He had lain in the snow for hours before his men found him. By the time they reached the canyon, following desperate rumors of shelter in the rocks, he was barely breathing. His skin was gray. His lips were blue. His fingers were black with frostbite. The 2 ranch hands stood in the cave entrance, snow falling from their hats, their faces showing the terrible journey they had made. "Please, ma'am, we did not know where else to go. The ranch house is destroyed. Half the bunkhouse collapsed. Mr. Crenshaw," he was trying to save the horses when his mare threw him. "We found him in a drift. He was almost gone." Cordelia looked down at the man who had promised to destroy her, the man who had called her a cave woman, the man who had threatened to cut her off from all human society, the man who had ridden out to her canyon with his men to mock and humiliate her, the man who was now dying. She could let him die. No one would blame her. After everything he had done, after all his cruelty and threats, he would simply be another victim of the storm. Another cautionary tale about the dangers of Arizona winters. But that was not who Cordelia Ashford was. That was not who her father had raised her to be. That was not who Everett had loved. "Bring him to the fire," she said. "Get those wet clothes off him. Someone heat more stones." She worked through the night, fighting to save the life of her enemy. His frostbite was severe. He would lose at least 2 fingers, maybe more. His lungs were damaged from breathing the frozen air. His heart was weak from hours of hypothermia. But he was alive. Against all odds, against all reason, against all justice, he was alive. Because Cordelia Ashford had chosen to save him. Harlan Crenshaw opened his eyes on the morning of December 27th. The storm had finally broken. Outside, an eerie silence had fallen over the canyon, the kind of silence that comes only after great violence. The wind had stopped. The snow had stopped. The world held its breath. Inside the cave, 23 people stirred from exhausted sleep, blinking in the lamplight, still not quite believing they were alive. Crenshaw looked around at the faces surrounding him. Families he knew from town. Workers from his own ranch. The Chinese traders he had always treated with contempt. The school teacher, the widows, and Cordelia Ashford, sitting beside the fire, dark circles under her eyes, her hands wrapped in bandages where she had rubbed them raw, caring for others. She had not slept in 4 days. "Water?" she asked, offering him a cup. He took it with trembling hands. Drank. Tried to speak. Found he had no words. Silas Brennan was the first to say what everyone was thinking. He stood in the center of the cave, his daughter sleeping peacefully in his arms. The people who had survived the storm gathered around him, waiting, sensing that something important was about to happen. "I owe this woman an apology," Brennan said. His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. "When she came to my store, I refused to help her. I laughed at her. I told others she was mad." He paused, looking at Cordelia. "I said a widow living in a cave was not civilized, not proper, not Christian." He took a breath. "I was wrong." The words hung in the air, heavier than they should have been. "This cave saved my daughter's life. It saved all our lives. And the woman who built it, the woman I mocked and scorned, she took us in without a word of reproach. She fed us. She healed us. She kept us warm while the world outside tried to kill us." He walked to where Cordelia sat and lowered himself to his knees. "I am sorry, Mrs. Ashford, for everything I said, for everything I did, for everything I failed to do." Cordelia looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached out and took his hand. "Rise, Mr. Brennan. Your daughter is safe. That is all that matters." Others followed. Clement Farrow, the builder who had called her work a tomb, admitted that he had never seen stonework so solid, so well designed, so perfectly suited to its purpose. Father O'Brien knelt in prayer, asking God's forgiveness for his failure to recognize his wisdom in unexpected places. Mrs. Whitmore, the society lady who had called Cordelia primitive, stood silent, unable to meet her eyes. Virgil Oakes, the young man who had bet she would fail, pressed $5 into her hand. "You won," he said simply. "The bet was I would win if you left. You did not leave." Cordelia almost smiled. "Keep your money, Mr. Oakes. Buy your mother something nice." Harlan Crenshaw was the last. He had watched the others make their apologies, their acknowledgments, their acts of contrition. He had said nothing, done nothing. His face had remained unreadable, a mask of stone. Now, as the others fell silent, he pushed himself to his feet. He was still weak. The cold had done damage that would take months to heal. His hands were bandaged where the frostbite had taken hold. But he stood anyway, drawing himself up to his full height, looking down at the woman who had saved his life. The cave fell silent. Everyone watched. Everyone waited. "I came to this territory 40 years ago," Crenshaw said slowly. "I built everything I have with my own hands, my ranch, my reputation, my power." He paused. "I have made enemies. I have made friends. I have made mistakes." He met Cordelia's eyes. "You were one of my mistakes." The words hung in the air. I saw a woman alone and I saw weakness. I saw someone living in a cave and I saw foolishness. I saw an opportunity to demonstrate my power and I took it. His voice hardened. I brought my men here to humiliate you. I told the town to shun you. I promised to make your life impossible. Cordelia said nothing, waited. And when I was dying in the snow, Crenshaw continued, when my horse had thrown me and the cold was taking me, you took me in. You warmed me. You saved my life. Without a word of accusation. Without a moment of hesitation. He lowered himself to his knees. The movement was slow, painful, the gesture of a proud man unfamiliar with humility. I do not deserve your forgiveness. I do not ask for it. But I owe you my life, Mrs. Ashford, and I acknowledge the debt. Whatever you need, whenever you need it, you have only to ask. He stayed there, kneeling on the stone floor, waiting for her response. Cordelia rose from her seat. She walked to where he knelt, this man who had tried to destroy her, and extended her hand. Rise, Mr. Crenshaw. He looked up at her, his eyes searching her face for judgment, for condemnation, for the revenge he surely deserved. He found only compassion. The storm spared no one, she said. It did not care about wealth or power or position. It cared only about who was prepared and who was not. She helped him to his feet. Perhaps we can all learn something from that. This is the moment of vindication Cordelia deserved. But the story is not over yet. What happened to her? What happened to the cave? What legacy did she leave behind? Continue reading to discover the rest. The blizzard of December 1882 killed 47 people across the Arizona territory. It collapsed barns and houses and churches. It killed cattle by the thousands. It was the worst storm in living memory, and its effects would be felt for years to come. But in Red Rock Canyon, not a single person died. 23 souls sheltered in a cave, kept warm by stone walls and ancient wisdom, survived the storm that should have killed them all. And when they emerged into the white silence of the aftermath, they carried with them something more valuable than their lives. They carried a lesson. Spring came slowly to the territory that year, as if winter was reluctant to release its grip. But when it finally arrived, it brought with it change. The landscape that emerged from beneath the melting snow was transformed. Where there had been ranches, there were now piles of rubble. Where there had been herds of cattle, there were now empty fields dotted with frozen carcasses. The blizzard had reshaped the territory as surely as an earthquake, and nothing would ever be quite the same. But with destruction came opportunity, and with opportunity came change. Silas Brennan was the first to ask for Cordelia's help. He came to her cave one morning in early April, hat in hand, humility in his eyes. His fine clothes were worn now, patched in places where they had torn during the long winter. His face was thinner than it had been. The storm had cost him everything except his life and his family. I want to rebuild, he said, but I want to rebuild differently. I saw how your cave kept its warmth while my house nearly killed my family. Could you teach me to build something similar? Cordelia studied him for a long moment. This was the man who had refused to rent her a room. The man who had laughed at her cave. The man who had told others she was mad. But that man had walked 3 miles through a killing storm to save his daughter. That man had knelt before her and apologized. That man had changed. I can teach you, she said, if you are willing to learn. He was willing. She showed him how to use stone instead of wood for critical supports. She taught him about thermal mass, about the way thick walls absorbed heat during warm days and released it during cold nights. She explained the principles her father had taught her in the mines of Cornwall, principles that had been understood by the Pueblo people for 1,000 years before any Europeans set foot on this continent. She showed him how to position windows to catch winter sun while blocking summer heat. She taught him how to create natural ventilation that would cool a house in summer without the drafts that would chill it in winter. She explained things that seemed like common sense to her, but that no one in Sweetwater had ever thought about. Brennan listened. He asked questions. He took notes in a little book he carried everywhere. And when she was finished teaching, he went back to town and started building. Clement Farrow came next, the professional builder setting aside his pride to learn from a widow with calloused hands. He watched her work with stone, listened to her explanations of airflow and insulation, and slowly began to understand that there was more to building than lumber and nails. By summer, 5 new structures had been built in and around Sweetwater using techniques Cordelia had learned from her father. Not caves exactly, but buildings that worked with the earth rather than against it. Buildings that stayed warm in winter and cool in summer. Buildings that would still be standing 100 years later. Thomas Chen became Cordelia's closest friend. They shared tea in the evenings, sitting at the entrance of her cave, watching the sun set over the red rocks while Copper dozed at their feet. "We are keepers of old wisdom," Thomas said once. "You and I, we remember what others have chosen to forget. Perhaps that is why we found each other." He smiled. Perhaps. Harlan Crenshaw was true to his word. He came to the cave in early May, his hands still bandaged, his steps still uncertain. The blizzard had cost him more than fingers. It had cost him cattle and buildings and men. It had cost him the certainty that had defined his life for 40 years. But perhaps, Cordelia thought as she watched him climb the path to her door, perhaps it had given him something in return. Something like humility. Something like wisdom. "I have a proposition," he said, standing in her doorway, unable to meet her eyes. "I am listening. I am offering you a partnership, not employment. Partnership. You would manage some of my more remote holdings with full authority to make decisions. In return, you would receive 20% of the profits and the promise of eventually acquiring your own herd." Cordelia studied him for a long moment. She remembered the man who had ridden to her canyon with his men, mocking her, threatening her. She remembered his smile, that cold smile that promised destruction. She remembered his words, "When you are dying of cold and hunger, remember that you could have left when you had the chance." That man had been certain of everything. This man was certain of nothing. "What say I?" she asked. Crenshaw finally looked at her. His eyes were different now, older, tired, touched by something that might have been regret. "Because I owe you my life. Because you saved my men when I could not. Because you were right about everything, and I was wrong about everything." He paused, swallowed hard. "And because this territory needs more people like you and fewer people like the man I used to be. I cannot undo what I did. I cannot take back the words I said, but I can try to be better. And helping you seems like a good place to start." It was the opportunity Cordelia had been seeking since she first arrived in the territory. A chance to build a future without sacrificing her independence. A chance to prove that everything she had suffered, everything she had built, had been worth it. "I accept," she said, "but I have conditions." "Name them." "You treat Thomas Chen with respect. You stop blocking Chinese traders from doing business in Sweetwater. You use your influence to make this territory welcome to everyone, not just the people who look like you." Crenshaw was silent for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. Agreed. They shook hands, standing in the entrance of the cave that had saved both their lives, sealing a partnership that neither of them could have imagined 6 months before. Within 2 years, she had saved enough to purchase her own land. She built a proper house there using the techniques she had learned from her father and perfected in her cave. But she never abandoned the cave itself. Instead, she maintained it as a way station for travelers, a refuge for those caught in storms, a testament to the wisdom of building with the earth rather than against it. A plaque appeared at the cave entrance, carved in stone. "Shelter for the weary, warmth for the cold. All are welcome." Young Phoebe Langston grew up to become a teacher, like Mary Douglas. But she never forgot what she had learned in those weeks at the cave. She taught her students about stone walls and thermal mass and the old ways of building. She married a carpenter and insisted their home be built according to Cordelia's principles. Her children grew up in a house that stayed warm in winter and cool in summer. They grew up hearing stories of the cave widow who had saved their grandparents' lives. They grew up knowing that wisdom could come from unexpected places. Little Nell Brennan never forgot the woman who had taught her to read stone, who had saved her life during the Great Blizzard. When she grew up and had children of her own, she named her first daughter Cordelia. Copper died in the spring of 1889. He was old by then, his muzzle gray, his eyes clouded with cataracts, his steps slow and careful where once they had been bounding and eager. He had been with Cordelia through everything: the death of Everett, the long, lonely journey west, the arrival in Sweetwater, the rejection, the building of the cave, the storm, the long years of peace that followed. He had been her companion when she had no other, her protector when danger threatened, her comfort when grief overwhelmed her. He had never doubted her, not once, not ever. When the whole world told her she was wrong, Copper had simply pressed his warm body against her legs and looked up at her with those trusting golden eyes. In his final days, he could no longer climb the path to the cave. So Cordelia carried him, cradling his old body in her arms as she had once cradled him as a puppy, the first night Everett brought him home. She laid him on his favorite blanket by the fire and sat with him through the long hours, stroking his fur, talking to him about the old days. She told him about Everett, about how they had met at that church social in Penzance, about the 12 happy years in the cottage by the sea, about the dreams they had shared, the life they had planned, the future that had been stolen from them. She told him about her father, the tin miner who had taught her to read the rock, about her mother who had worried that her daughter was too independent, too willful, too unwilling to fit into the mold society had prepared for her. She told him about the journey west, about the deserts and mountains and endless plains, about the night Everett died, and the morning she had buried him, and the terrible emptiness that had followed. She told him everything, and Copper listened with the patience he had always shown, his tail giving a weak wag now and then, his eyes never leaving her face. He died peacefully, in his favorite spot by the fire, with Cordelia's hand on his head and her voice in his ears. "Good boy," she whispered as his breathing slowed. "Good loyal boy. You never doubted me. Not once, not ever. You were the best friend I ever had, and I will miss you every day for the rest of my life." She buried him beside the cave entrance, in a spot where the morning sun would warm the earth above him. She dug the grave herself, refusing all offers of help. This was something she had to do alone, as she had done so many things alone. The headstone she carved herself, spending 3 days shaping the letters with hammer and chisel. Copper, the most loyal friend. He never doubted. For weeks afterwards, she would wake in the night and reach for him, expecting to feel his warm body pressed against her legs. And every time she found only empty air, she would cry, mourning him as she had mourned Everett, mourning him as she had mourned her father, mourning all the losses that had shaped her life. Cordelia Ashford lived to be 54 years old. She spent her final years in the house she had built on her own land, a house constructed according to all the principles she had learned from her father and perfected in her cave. The walls were thick stone. The windows were positioned to catch winter sun. The floors stayed cool in summer and warm in winter. She never remarried, though she had received several proposals over the years. Some had been sincere offers of partnership. Others had been thinly veiled attempts to gain control of the property and wealth she had accumulated. She had declined them all. "I had one great love," she told Thomas Chen once, when he asked why she remained alone. "One man who saw me as I truly was and loved me anyway. Not many people find that even once. I will not dishonor what we had by settling for less." In her final autumn, she grew weak. The doctors in Sweetwater, better trained now than they had been in 1882, could not say exactly what was wrong. Her body was simply tired, they said, worn out from a life of hard work and harder challenges. There was nothing to be done but make her comfortable and wait. She died on a Tuesday morning, just as the sun was painting the desert in shades of gold and pink. She died in her bed, surrounded by friends, her last breath carrying her toward whatever awaited on the other side. Some said she died with a smile on her face. Some said she whispered a name as she passed, though no one could agree on whose name it was. Some said it was Everett. Others said it was Copper. Perhaps it was both. More than 200 people attended her funeral. They came from across the territory, from ranches and towns and settlements she had touched over the years. Children she had helped deliver, including 3 she had brought into the world during the Great Blizzard. Adults she had helped build, teaching them the old ways of working with stone. Grandchildren of the 23 who had sheltered in her cave during the storm. children who had grown up hearing stories of the cave widow who had saved their families. Silas Brennan spoke at the service. So did Phoebe Langston, now a grandmother herself. So did Thomas Chen, his voice breaking as he remembered his old friend. She was a keeper of wisdom, Thomas said. She remembered what others had forgotten, and she shared that wisdom freely, asking nothing in return but the chance to help. They buried her on her own land beside the house she had built, but they placed a marker at the cave as well, so that future generations would know who had lived there and what she had accomplished. Cordelia Ashford, 1848 to 1902. She built with stone. She lived with courage. She loved without condition. In 1952, 70 years after the Great Blizzard, engineers from the University of Arizona conducted a study of historic structures in the territory. They were particularly interested in buildings that had survived the intervening decades, structures that had proven their durability against time and weather and the relentless Arizona sun. One of the sites they studied was a cave in Red Rock Canyon. Dr. James Whitfield led the expedition, bringing with him a team of graduate students and enough equipment to measure everything from temperature to humidity to airflow. They had heard stories about the cave, stories that seemed too remarkable to be true. A woman from England building a home underground in the 1880s. A blizzard that killed dozens but spared everyone who sheltered in her cave. Principles of construction that seemed impossibly advanced for their time. The scientists arrived expecting to debunk a legend. What they found instead was confirmation. The cave maintained a constant temperature of 54 degrees Fahrenheit, summer and winter, exactly as Cordelia had claimed all those years ago. The thick stone walls that she had built at the entrance provided what modern engineers call thermal mass, absorbing heat during warm periods and releasing it during cold ones. The natural ventilation system created air circulation without drafts, keeping the air fresh without losing warmth. This is remarkable, Dr. Whitfield wrote in his report. The builder of this structure, working alone in the 1880s with nothing but hand tools and local materials, intuitively understood principles of passive thermal design that were not formally codified until the 20th century. The construction techniques employed here anticipate developments in sustainable architecture by nearly 100 years. They found other things as well. The mortar Cordelia had mixed from red clay and sand had hardened over the decades into something nearly as strong as concrete. The stone wall, which Clement Farrow had predicted would collapse within a year, showed no signs of structural failure. The wooden door and shutters had been replaced at some point, but the stone framework remained as solid as the day it was built. In the deepest part of the cave, they found the spring that had provided Cordelia with fresh water. They tested it and found it to be pure, free of the contamination that plagued so many water sources in the developing West. The cave's natural filtration system had kept the water clean for 70 years and would likely keep it clean for 70 more. The principles Cordelia had used were not primitive. They were not foolish. They were not the desperate improvisations of a woman with no other options. They were, in fact, the same principles used in modern passive solar design, in underground homes, in the most advanced sustainable architecture of the 21st century. The Earth remembers what we forget. The Earth protects what we cannot protect ourselves. She had been right all along, and the people who had mocked her had been wrong. There is a quote carved into the wall of the cave at Red Rock Canyon. It has been there since 1882, when a widow from Cornwall first made that cave her home. It reads, "They laughed at my cave, then they needed my cave." Below it, in smaller letters, added years later by hands unknown, "Wisdom does not come from where people expect. It comes from those who listen to the earth." The cave is still there. If you know where to look, if you follow the creek north until the red rocks rise around you like cathedral walls, you can find it. The entrance is wider now, worn by a century of visitors. The wall Cordelia built still stands, though weather and time have softened its edges. Inside, the temperature is 54 degrees, give or take. It was 54 degrees when Cordelia first walked through that entrance, a grieving widow with nothing but a dog and a dream. It was 54 degrees when 23 people huddled there, waiting out the worst storm in memory. It will be 54 degrees long after we are all gone, Because the earth keeps its own counsel. It does not listen to the mockery of men. It does not bow to social convention. It simply endures. And sometimes it shelters those wise enough to listen. This is the end of Cordelia's story. But in another way, it is just the beginning. The lessons she taught, the wisdom she preserved, the example she set, these things ripple outward through time, touching lives that will never know her name. Every time someone builds with the earth instead of against it, every time someone stands firm against mockery and doubt, every time someone chooses compassion over revenge, help over abandonment, wisdom over pride, in those moments, Cordelia Ashford lives on. What about you? Is there something in your life that others have mocked? Some wisdom you hold that the world does not understand? Some dream you have been told is foolish, impossible beneath you? Perhaps today is the day to trust yourself, to build anyway, to prove them wrong. If you found meaning in this story, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like this video. Subscribe to this channel. And remember, home is never about four walls and a roof. It is about the choices you make, the people you help, and the courage to stand firm when the whole world calls you crazy. Until next time.